Mark was a successful real estate agent, having established himself firmly at a young age. He was charming and articulate, often called the golden boy of his industry. He ran his own company, with clients scattered across the city. Day after day, his busy work schedule brought him substantial income and social standing. His wife, Laura, was a typical homemaker. She had given up her own career to focus entirely on their family, taking care of their 2 children, Jack, their teenage son, and Amy, their younger daughter. Laura was gentle and thoughtful, always taking care of everything at home. From the outside, their family seemed perfect, harmonious, and ideal. But the reality, as it often is, was far from the surface impression. As Mark's career took off, the closeness in their family began to fray. Mark's work became increasingly demanding. He was constantly meeting clients, attending meetings, and even working weekends. Laura, who had once relied on him for support and companionship, started feeling lonely and neglected. Every small task around the house now fell solely on her shoulders. She began to feel isolated, and her sense of emotional abandonment grew as her husband became more and more absent. Mark, however, seemed oblivious to this change, his attention entirely consumed by his career while neglecting the emotional needs of his wife. Meanwhile, Mark's father, Peter Wells, increasingly became an important figure in her life. Peter had once been a prominent businessman, but after the death of his wife, he fell into a deep loneliness. No longer as active in business, he began to seek companionship from his daughter. Peter frequently visited their home, often using boredom as an excuse, simply to sit with Laura and chat over tea. In those days, Peter would walk with Laura in the evenings or sit with her at the dinner table to discuss everyday matters. Laura found solace in her father's company, feeling a warmth and safety she had missed. Peter's presence was a source of comfort, offering someone to talk to and understand her struggles. This shift in their relationship, however, went unnoticed by Laura. Her dependence on Peter began to take on a different dimension, evolving into something more complex. It was no longer merely emotional support from Peter, but a deeper emotional attachment. When she was with Peter, Laura felt an unprecedented sense of peace and fulfillment. Whenever she was exhausted or discouraged, Peter's presence felt like a safe harbor, and he, in turn, found comfort in her growing dependence. One cold evening, everything changed. It was a winter night, with the wind howling outside and the air filled with a biting chill. Mark was working late, and Laura sat alone on the sofa, watching television. Peter, as usual, came to visit her. They sat together in the living room. Peter poured her a cup of hot tea, and they casually talked about daily life. That night, however, the atmosphere felt unusually quiet. Laura, feeling a strange stirring within her, couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The conversation they shared no longer felt like a casual exchange, but one that had slowly deepened. Peter's gaze was softer than usual, and his tone was more tender. Laura found herself drawn to him in a way she had never expected. At that moment, Peter seemed to realize something. His eyes lingered on Laura's face longer than before, his gaze slowly drifting to her slightly trembling lips. The air between them grew thick with tension, and neither of them spoke. They simply sat across from each other, caught in a silence that seemed to speak volumes. There was an unspoken understanding between them, as if their hearts were quietly communicating. Suddenly, Peter reached out, gently cupping Laura's face with his hand, and whispered, "You will always be the most important person to me. I'll always be here for you." In that instant, Laura's heart skipped a beat. It was as if something inside her broke, and yet something else, something deep within her, was ignited. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply gazed back at her Peter, her eyes filled with complicated emotions, both the dependence on his Peterly love and an unspoken desire she couldn't fully understand. That night marked the first real emotional contact between them. There were no words exchanged, only the stillness in the air and the silent resonance of their heartbeats. Laura closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her Peter's hand on her face. Peter's voice, low and soothing, seemed to cast a spell over her, and her thoughts became hazy. Her breath quickened, and the suppressed emotions inside her began to spill over. In that moment, Laura felt a tangle of emotions, both shame and longing, that she couldn't escape. As the days passed, Peter and Laura began to meet more frequently. Their relationship deepened in secrecy. Whenever Laura felt down, her Peter would appear by her side, offering comfort. They would drink tea, take walks, or simply sit together on the sofa late at night, sharing quiet moments. Laura began to unconsciously depend on his company, and slowly her feelings for him grew more complicated. She knew these feelings were forbidden, that they should never have existed, but she couldn't resist the powerful attraction she felt toward him. Peter, too, seemed to be aware of the changes, yet he never mentioned them. His gaze became more tender, and his gestures more intimate. Each interaction, each touch, only pulled them deeper into a dangerous, unspoken relationship. Though both of them knew the gravity of their emotions, the growing shame and hesitation, every encounter seemed to make it harder to break free. Laura understood that if their secret were to be exposed, everything would be destroyed. But she found herself unable to stop the longing that stirred within her, unable to escape the emotional pull of her Peter's presence. Laura and Peter's secret meetings were filled with tension and unease from the very beginning. Every time they met, they carefully avoided the gaze of family and friends, as if everything had become almost natural in their unspoken understanding. Whenever Laura said she was going for a walk or to meet a friend in the evening, Mark no longer believed her words so easily. He noticed that Laura always carried her phone with her, and whenever she was alone with her father, she made sure to avoid any interruption. Laura's eyes began to shift away when he looked at her, and her tone became colder, more distant, something he had never felt before. Laura knew deep down that she had crossed a moral line, but each time she met with her father, the guilt and desire mixed into a complex emotion, pulling her deeper into this relationship she couldn't escape. Peter's companionship had become the only support in her life. He was no longer just her father. He had become the emotional solace, the refuge for her lonely soul. Although her heart was filled with shame, every encounter with Peter brought a kind of fulfillment that she had never experienced before, something Mark could no longer provide her with, due to the growing distance between them. In these secret meetings, Peter never directly said anything to provoke the forbidden connection between them. But his gaze, his touches, and even their silent understanding made Laura's heart filled with contradictions and confusion. She tried to convince herself that this was nothing more than emotional comfort for her lonely father, but she knew deep inside that it had gone too far. However, Mark began to sense something was wrong. He had been busy with work, but recently some subtle details made him suspicious. Laura started leaving the house more often, and whenever she did, she always tightly gripped her phone, as if afraid he might see something. She and Peter spent more time alone together, sometimes leaving the house at odd hours. And whenever Mark saw Peter leaving, Laura would lower her head in guilt, avoiding his gaze. Mark's instincts told him something was off between his wife and father. Although he was reluctant to accept this, his suspicions kept growing. Every night, as he pondered, the question haunted him. What had caused Laura to become so distant and cold? He started paying closer attention to her every movement, watching for the smallest signs. He began snooping through Laura's phone, checking her messages and call logs. Each discovery seemed to silently confirm his darkest suspicions. One day, he accidentally saw Laura putting a photo into her bag. It was a picture of her and Peter sitting together at a restaurant. In the photo, Peter's hand was gently resting on Laura's shoulder, and his gaze toward her was filled with tenderness. At that moment, Mark felt his heart gripped by a cold hand, and an intense pain spread through his chest. He fought to hold back his anger, silently leaving the room. As the days passed, Mark's suspicions grew deeper. He paid even more attention to Laura's actions, staring at her phone and purse, hoping to find anything that would confirm his fears. Until one night, Mark decided to follow Laura and see where she was really going. That evening, as usual, Laura hurriedly left the house, and Mark quietly followed her. Keeping a distance, he trailed her to a cafe in the city center. When Laura entered the cafe and sat down at a corner table with Peter, Mark stayed at a distance, watching as they exchanged quiet words. Peter laughed softly from time to time, and Laura, too, smiled occasionally. Her eyes held a tenderness he had never seen in her before. Mark's feelings became complicated. Anger mingled with deep pain as he observed the scene. He didn't approach them, but stayed in the distance, silently watching this moment unfold. In that instant, he seemed to understand the unspoken bond between his wife and father. The closeness between them was undeniable, and it was a connection that no matter how hard he tried, he could never mend. That night, when Mark returned home, he could no longer control his emotions. He had pieced together enough to form a clear picture of the secret they were hiding. His heart was torn with pain and disbelief. Every night he found himself replaying the fragments of evidence, the clues that seemed to point toward a betrayal he could never have imagined. He now realized that the betrayal had silently taken root in a place he could not see, and that Laura and Peter's relationship was no longer just that of father and daughter, but a hidden secret, an unspoken emotional entanglement. Mark knew that behind all of this was a bottomless abyss, and he was already deep inside it. As the anger accumulated, Mark stopped thinking about the consequences of revenge. He could no longer remain calm, and the emotional wound inside him drove him to the brink of losing his sanity. Revenge became urgent. He wanted everything to pay for his pain. He began imagining the perfect plan for revenge, but the rational part of him reminded him that every move had to be cautious or the consequences would be unbearable. His first thought was to destroy Peter's life. In his mind, he plotted how to make his father lose everything and experience the pain he himself was going through. However, he quickly realized that simply exposing Peter's affair wouldn't be enough to satisfy his thirst for vengeance. He wanted something more direct, more shocking, something that would make everything irreversible. Next, Mark began to prepare. He found an inconspicuous store online that sold items without complicated background checks. He spent several days patiently selecting a handgun. The gun was ordinary in appearance, able to pass unnoticed, yet it was highly accurate. Mark knew it wouldn't be easy to buy a weapon, but through private channels, he was able to obtain it. The process was nearly trouble-free. He hid the gun in his car and, once home, carefully stashed it away in an old toolbox in the garage, ensuring no one would find it. To ensure there would be no evidence left behind, Mark meticulously planned every detail. Every day he checked the handgun and practiced how to wipe off fingerprints, making sure everything was as flawless as possible. As time passed, the revenge plan took shape in his mind. He knew he had to make it appear as if this was a sudden, unavoidable accident. Only then could he escape without suspicion. On the night of June 18, 2014, the air was filled with an indescribable sense of tension. Mark had prepared everything well in advance. His plan was finally about to unfold. The evening sky gradually darkened, and the traffic on the streets thinned out, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to drape the entire city like a veil. Mark's heartbeat quickened as he knew there was no turning back now. The moment for his revenge had come. He parked his car at the corner not far from Peter's house, rolling down the window slightly, letting the cool evening breeze brush his face. His palms were slightly sweaty, and his eyes remained fixed on the front door of Peter's house, waiting patiently. Tonight he knew Peter would be home alone. This was the moment he had carefully calculated. Mark remembered clearly that Peter wasn't close to him, and tonight Peter was going to become the target of Mark's vengeance. After what seemed like an eternity, Peter finally walked down the driveway and entered his home alone, just after 8 p.m. Mark knew the time had come. He quickly got out of the car and crossed the street, walking silently toward the side door of Peter's house, the one he had obtained a spare key for many years ago. His fingers gripped the key tightly, and with a calm breath he inserted it into the lock. The door clicked open quietly. Mark inhaled deeply, holding his breath, and entered the house without making a sound. The house was silent, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen breaking the stillness. Mark looked around cautiously, making sure no one else was around. He paused at the staircase, waiting, then proceeded slowly. His heart raced, but he pushed the feeling aside. All that mattered now was his revenge. The anger and coldness that had consumed him for so long surged within him, pushing aside any other thoughts. Peter was now just a figure in the countdown of death. Mark pulled the gun from his jacket, the cold steel of the weapon a chilling reminder of what was to come. When Peter looked up and saw him, his eyes widened in shock and confusion, but there was no time for words. Mark's hand moved with determination, and he raised the gun, pointing it directly at Peter's chest. There was no hesitation. The trigger was pulled. Bang! Bang! The two sharp gunshots echoed through the empty house, reverberating through every corner. Peter's body slumped back into the chair, and the magazine he was holding slipped from his hands as blood quickly pooled around him. Mark stood still, staring at what he had done. The man who had once been part of his family now lay lifeless in front of him, but there was no satisfaction in the act. Instead, a deep, cold emptiness settled into his chest. He quickly moved to stage the scene, wiping down the gun and placing it in Peter's hand. He rearranged the room, making it appear as though a struggle had occurred, trying to make the murder look like a failed robbery. Time seemed to stretch as Mark methodically worked, each movement deliberate and calculated. He knew this had to be perfect. There could be no evidence linking him to the crime. After ensuring the scene was meticulously staged, he left the house as quietly as he had entered, stepping into the car and pulling away. The windows rolled up slowly, and the world outside seemed strangely still. His heart, though, was pounding. He had no satisfaction from the revenge he had just carried out, only an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The very thing he thought would bring him relief now seemed to have led him into an even deeper abyss. Mark realized with a shiver that vengeance had not freed him. It had only chained him to a fate darker than before. Meanwhile, the police investigation was quietly underway. Initial investigations at the crime scene didn't reveal many obvious clues. Peter's possessions seemed untouched, and the house didn't appear to have been ransacked. The only unusual thing was that Peter's death didn't look like a typical robbery. There were no signs of violent struggle. In fact, everything seemed eerily quiet. Though the police initially leaned toward the robbery gone wrong theory, something about the scene didn't sit right. As the investigation deepened, the police began to notice subtle details. They found that the relationship between Peter and Laura wasn't just a typical father-in-law and daughter-in-law bond. They had frequently dined together, gone out, and spent time alone, even when Laura's husband, Mark, wasn't around. Investigators also found that Peter had often visited their house alone, leading them to suspect that there was more to their relationship than initially apparent. They slowly began to focus their attention on the complicated emotional entanglements within the family. At the same time, Mark's behavior began to raise suspicions with the police. Though he appeared calm, his testimony and alibi showed several inconsistencies. Mark claimed he had been home alone on the night of the murder, but no one could corroborate his story. Further investigation into his phone records revealed several calls made to Peter's neighborhood that night. However, the most crucial evidence came when the police found a pair of gloves in Mark's car. The gloves, although cleaned, still had traces of gunpowder, linking them directly to the shooting. Piece by piece, the investigators started to connect the dots, and it became increasingly clear that Mark Harris, Laura's husband and Peter's son, was their prime suspect. As the investigation progressed, Mark was finally called in for questioning. Faced with a mounting pile of incriminating evidence, his composure began to falter. Though he continued to deny involvement, his nervousness and the contradictions in his account became more evident. The police methodically chipped away at his defense, and it became clear that Mark could no longer deny the reality of his actions. In August 2014, Mark's trial finally began. The proceedings were tense and silent. Although the defense tried to argue that Mark had been temporarily insane, hoping to reduce his sentence, the evidence was airtight and could not be ignored. Throughout the trial, all the evidence showing Mark's purchase of a gun and his meticulous planning for revenge was presented, each piece chillingly clear. Even Mark, who had once been so confident in his actions, now sat in silence, unable to offer any reasonable explanation. In the end, the judge pronounced the verdict. Mark was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mark's face was like a stone sculpture, his eyes fixed ahead, devoid of any emotion. When the bailiffs stepped forward to handcuff him, leading him away from the court, his hands trembled slightly, as if he had only then truly realized the irreparable damage he had caused. He had once firmly believed that revenge would give him peace, but in the end it had dragged him and his family into a bottomless pit. Regret and despair spread across his heart, and he could no longer imagine the life he once had. He dared not even confront his past. Meanwhile, Laura's life was already undergoing drastic changes. She no longer stayed in the city that had once been familiar to her. Instead, she moved with her children to a new place, beginning a new life. She didn't want to look back, nor did she want to face that chapter that had almost destroyed her. Despite this, the shadow of the past never fully lifted. She knew that the consequences of Mark's actions had not only shattered her family, but also destroyed her faith in love and trust. In her new environment, Laura did everything she could to provide a peaceful life for her children. She gave them a fresh start and tried to build them a warm home. However, deep down, Laura had not fully healed. In the stillness of the night, she often found herself lost in thought, recalling the beautiful moments with Mark before everything fell apart, the death of Peter, and the terrifying revenge plot. She knew that all of this would forever follow her, an indelible scar on her soul. Laura often struggled within herself. She wanted to create a future free from violence and fear for her children, but at the same time, the painful past lingered, constantly reminding her of the choices she had made and the mistakes she had suffered. She knew that although she had left the city and the home filled with tragedy, she could never escape the wounds in her heart. She prayed for herself and her children, hoping that they would find true happiness in their new life. But she also understood that some scars would never heal.